Sometimes when the answers we want aren't given, we have to find them for ourselves.
Thank you for clicking on this video. I'm Brooke Makenna, but today we are going to be talking about a girl named Hazel Drew. Now, her story, her legacy, gets to live on even though she had such a tragic end, because there is actually an entire TV show based on this case, and that is because of the very strange elements that surround the entire case. And I'm surprised that it's actually not talked about more. So that is why today I want to tell Hazel's story. By the way, I'm doing Suspect Summer, if you didn't know. And I'm going to be posting so much content like this summer. So if you are interested, please show me some support by subscribing or by thumbsing up or by leaving a nice comment down below. I really love the interaction from you guys and seeing that you like these videos just as much as I love doing them. So let's get back to the story. So Hazel Irene Drew was born on June 3rd of 1888, and she was born to John and Julia Drew. She actually had an older brother who was 2 years older, and she was the second born. They were born really into a not very wealthy family. They were just pretty average, but in the town where they were at, they lived in Sand Lake in New York. They were basically the poorest of the poor. This town was filled with many wealthy families, and so compared to them, they were really on the lower side, but they were probably pretty average, to be honest, in most places. At the age of 13, Hazel actually had 6 siblings by then. I was working as a domestic servant for some of those wealthy families by the time she was 14. Her youngest 2 siblings actually passed away, unfortunately, and back then there was many infectious diseases. There wasn't ways to treat them, and it was very common for especially little kids to pass away. I don't think that there was any foul play involved in their death, but they did pass away. Hazel's favorite member of the family was her aunt, and they just got along really well ever since she was a baby. But Hazel was the type of girl that was described as classy and polite and fashionable, and people really loved her, including the people that she worked for. These wealthy families invited her into their home to do household chores, to take care of their home, and they didn't think of her as some poor, lowly person. I don't believe. They really kind of held her to a higher standard than they would hold most people that were below them, or so they thought. So Sand Lake in the 18 and 1900s was really described as having landscape more than the people. The landscape seemed to kind of take over the roads and the buildings, and there was barely any place for people to kind of get through and go through. And there was also mountains surrounding the area, so it was also kind of a drizzly and gray climate. So it really wasn't a bad place to be, but it wasn't the best, happiest, most cheerful place to be in the world. Hazel was a very beautiful woman her entire life, but in 1908 she was 20 years old and she was exceptionally beautiful. She had very voluminous blonde hair, she had beautiful blue eyes, and she had a very independent personality. She'd been working since she was 14 years old, and she knew how to take care of herself. But on July 7th of that year, she went missing. That evening, she had actually said that she was going to go on a walk down Taborton Road, which was basically like the main road in town, and she was going to go pick some raspberries. This was confirmed by a 35-year-old salesman, or charcoal peddler, which was what he was called in that time, who had been driving his wagon through town when he picked up a man named Frank Smith who asked him for a ride. Frank Smith actually knew Hazel, and so when he saw her as they were driving down the road, he stopped, of course, to say hello. Now, Frank was just a teenage farmhand. He was 17 years old, and it was apparent that he fancied or really liked Hazel. So, of course, when he saw her, he wanted to make a big expression of a greeting. And Hazel kind of reciprocated it, not really in a fancy way, but just in a polite way. She was wearing a black rimmed straw hat, which actually had plums on it and a monogrammed pin that had an H on it, and she took it off with her gloved hands and kind of like waved it at him just to kind of say hello. They stopped, they talked for a little bit, and then after a while the charcoal peddler, who was actually named Rodolphe Gandrum, and Frank Smith headed along on Taborton Road and left Hazel there to pick her raspberries. But those two were the last two to see Hazel Drew alive. 4 days later, on July 11th, her body was discovered in Teal's Pond in that same area, face down and floating. Her body was bloated and very decomposed already, but there was no water in her lungs, and there was a fracture to the back of her skull. It was found that she had been killed by a strike to the back of the head, and it didn't have anything to do with drowning. The water had distorted her body so bad in those 4 days that the only deciphering factors that they had that this was Hazel Drew was the fact that she had gold fillings in her teeth. So from the beginning, the evidence was overwhelming that this was a murder. She also had a ribbon tied delicately around her neck when they found her, and the autopsy report quoted that she was well formed in her figure, which led many to believe that she was pregnant in this time. Her gloves that she was wearing were actually found 20 feet from the shore, folded nicely together, and her straw hat was sitting right next to it. Now, this case, this body that was found, Hazel Drew's body, was covered in, coast to coast news coverage. People were really trying to figure out what had happened. She was even in the Washington Post trying to figure out what had happened to this young girl. But no leads were coming in. There was very little to go on as far as what actually happened, who was involved. And like I said before, this was such a small town, so the fact that nobody knew what happened or had an idea of the person or persons that could be involved was insane. The road that she was last seen on, Taborton, actually led to Teal's Pond. So did she walk there herself, or was she forced there? Nobody knew. This was a town that was 10,000, maybe even less people in it. But there were campers, there were squirrel hunters, there were fishermen, and it was kind of known that after dark it was not really safe for women to be alone. But Hazel was a strong, independent girl who thought she could take care of herself, and unfortunately, whoever did this to her was too strong even for her. The weeks following her murder, the police brought in many suspects to question about her death. First being a very odd suspect to me, her uncle. His name was William Taylor, and he was widowed, he was suicidal, and he was clearly unstable. They brought him in because of his odd behavior, which just continued during questioning, but there was never any evidence to link him to it, so they had to let him go. They of course questioned the last two people to see her, Rodolphe and Frank. Frank seemed to be a very simple-minded 17-year-old boy who gave them different information every time, and Rodolphe didn't really know much, but they both had alibis that checked out, so they were cleared as well. Also, another pair of men were questioned, and their names are unknown to the public that I could find, but they were questioned because a couple was driving by and saw them around Teal's Pond around the same time that she would have been murdered. And one was kind of sitting in a horse-drawn carriage, and the other one was looking in the bushes like he was looking for something or for someone, and they found it very odd, so when her body turned up, that's when they called it in to the police as a tip. But I don't believe anything came of that either. With so many suspects and such a small town, it was insane that the killer had still not been found. It seemed that they were doing the best job they could at the time. Really nothing was being done. So that's when they started digging into what Hazel Drew had been doing before she was murdered. And a few days leading up to it, she had actually quit her job. She had been working as a governess for a Professor Edward Carey and his wife 24 minutes away in Troy, New York. She had been away with her cousins for a weekend trip, and when she came back, she immediately quit for an unknown reason to anybody and left the same day. Then her luggage was found at the train station that she would have taken back, But the train station didn't go to Sand Lake. It went to Albany, which was about 10 minutes away. How did she get from Albany to Sand Lake, and why wouldn't she take her stuff? While the officers talked to her family and friends, they had told them that Hazel didn't have any sort of special love interest of any kind. But District Attorney Jarvis P. O'Brien actually found some strange things in a locked trunk that Hazel had. It was postcards and letters back and forth between her and many men, all just signed with initials. So there again, he still didn't have names, just initials, but it was still seemed as though it was more of a relationship than what her family and friends thought she had. This is when the rumors started to come forward that the people of the town believed that Hazel and her aunt that I was telling you about before that she loved so much were actually prostitutes in the area, or sex workers. They basically said that they had seen them go around in horse-drawn carriages with multiple men multiple different times throughout the night, and so they believed that that's how they made their money. This was never confirmed nor denied by the aunt, but it's a rumor that went around, which of course we know that in cases like this where there's nothing to go on, when there's a rumor that seems likely, people stick to it no matter if there's fact to it or not, which is so unfortunate. Even more suspects were brought in after that involving Hazel's murder, one being a dentist that had proposed to her at one time, one being a train conductor that it was thought that Hazel was possibly seeing, and one being a millionaire named Henry Cramroth. Now this man really didn't have anything as far as like a personal connection with Hazel, but it's what he did for a business that really made police want to question him. He apparently ran a resort in the area that was kind of very odd to everybody around. It was rumored to actually be holding women against their will. Neighbors and people driving by would often see women running about naked, almost like they were running from something. And there were also screams heard many times by neighbors, especially on the night that Hazel was supposedly murdered. That is when they wanted to bring him in and really question him about what he was doing. Yet nobody was ever arrested or charged with Hazel Drew's murder, and the investigation ended abruptly after a month. This was said to be because she wasn't a wealthy woman in town, and they didn't want to waste their resources on her when there were other people in the town to take care of. Now during this time, Hazel's mother, Julia, actually believed that a man who said he had hypnotic powers in Troy, where she was working, had kind of given her like a mysterious influence, or held a mysterious influence over her, and was the reason that she had died. But nothing was ever done as far as that lead either, and Hazel Irene Drew was buried in Brookside Cemetery in New York, and unfortunately she went to her grave without justice. This case is still unsolved to this day, and it is speculated throughout this town that Hazel actually haunts the very pond, Teal's Pond, that she died in. It is said she does this waiting for her killer to be caught. This is something that the people of the town really either believe or just kind of say because everybody else does as a rumor, but it is really talked about. And the people of this town, especially the guy I'm about to tell you about. A man named Mark Frost actually had a grandmother who lived in the area at the time of Hazel's murder, still lives there today, and she told him that he should never venture out in the woods at night for this very reason, that Hazel was there and would haunt him. This stuck with Mark until he was an adult, and that is when he came up with the concept of a TV show. With co-writer David Lynch, he came up with the show Twin Peaks. And this was basically a story about her murder, about the strange elements in this case that were already basically TV material because they were so strange. And in a way, it honored Hazel because this case was swept under the rug and no one really seemed to care about it anymore. This was bringing a whole new light to it. 20 years after Hazel's murder, this show, Twin Peaks, based on her, aired in 1990 on BBC Two. More than 8 million people tuned in weekly. The show actually opened with the discovery of a body wrapped in plastic of 17-year-old Laura Palmer, who was really based on Hazel. It was based in a town called Twin Peaks, which was a fictional world, a small town, and there were so many similarities to this case. Real life, I mean, they didn't have to change many things. Many of the suspects, many of the characters, like major characters, were still the same, just tweaked a little bit. I've never personally seen this show, but from what I read about it, it's something that any of you who like these videos would like. And it's also a way to kind of give Hazel the spotlight and the recognition she deserved. So I'm going to read to you a little bit of what it's about to see if you maybe would like to watch it. This series is a crime drama mixed with healthy doses of the surreal. It's described as a series about FBI agent Dale Cooper, who travels to the small logging town of Twin Peaks to solve the murder of a seemingly innocent high schooler, Laura Palmer. Almost nothing is as it seems, however, and the show's sometimes eerie visuals, oddball characters, and wild dream sequences drive the point home. Apparently this show ran for 2 seasons in 1990 and 1991, and then had like a small reboot to finish out the story in 2017. I'm really wanting to watch it, but if you do watch it, or if you have, please let me know down below what you thought, and if it was similar to Hazel's story at all. Now, whether this woman was poor, rich, sexually active, not mysterious, or open, she deserved to have her murder solved, and that is why I wanted to do this case, because I know that having it be from many, many, many years ago, I can't do much. But it's about their story and about letting them live through their lives and their story and sharing that with more people. I think that that's so important when there's nothing else you can do to tell someone's story for them. You tell me, what do you think happened to Hazel Drew? Do you think her possible pregnancy was what got her murdered? Or do you think it was the possible prostitution that did? After doing my researching, I kind of had a slight theory that maybe the reason she so abruptly quit her job was because she had just found out she was pregnant. She told the baby daddy, and the baby daddy said that she needed to come back to her hometown of Sand Lake and they would work it out together. So she did, and then when she got there, it was all just a cover-up to get rid of her and the baby, because this man didn't want her or the baby in his life. It's also been said that possibly this baby daddy, could have been married in the area and didn't want anything to do with her or want anybody or his wife to know that this happened. I mean, I would really love to know if she was actually pregnant, because if so, I mean, this makes this tragic case even more horrific, but it could also lead to so many answers as to why it happened and who did it, if that was just looked into a little bit more. I really do think that the police did well in the beginning, but then after a while kind of just gave up and realized that she wasn't as good as the other people in the area that needed protecting, so she was just kind of dropped, which is ridiculous, absolutely ridiculous. But I think that's how a lot of times it goes in many aspects of life. If you don't have money, you're not as worthy. I want you guys to know, if nobody's ever told you, no matter if you're poor, if you're rich, you are still the same amount of worthy. If you are a good person, it doesn't matter how much money you have. Please know that, and please treat people accordingly, no matter if they're your waitress, if they're a janitor, or if they're the CEO of a company, or if they're your idol. Everyone deserves the same worth, and I hope that all of you out there know that, because you deserve the same worth as Beyonce. And yeah, I just said that because you do. We're all just humans, and nobody deserves to be treated like Hazel Drew, or even just badly in general. So before I go off onto a rant, remember to tell me down below if you've watched Twin Peaks. It is a show over in Britain, so I've never watched it before, but if you have, please let me know if you like it. And if there are similarities to this case, because I'd really love to know. They really have said that there are so many, and that is basically the whole premise of the show, is that it is this case, but of course they've changed things for TV to make it a little more interesting. And I know in the end, Laura Palmer, the girl in the show, the fictional character, the main character, was actually, her murder was solved. That is of course very different than Hazel Drew's, which is unfortunate, but I could see why they would do it in a show, because people do want that closure, just like I'm sure Hazel Drew's family did as well. But yeah, feel free to always leave your thoughts. If they're nice and kind down below in the comments, any theories you have, and I'll let you guys go. Bye.
But sometimes healing is making up your own story in hopes that the real one is finally told.